At noon on December 8, 1941, 449 United States Marines stood on a tiny coral atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, watching the horizon for an enemy they knew was coming. Wake Island was barely 3 square miles of coral, scrub brush and sand, shaped like a wishbone and sitting almost exactly between Hawaii and the Philippines. The island had one strategic value: an airfield that could serve as a refueling stop for aircraft crossing the Pacific. That airfield made Wake Island important enough to defend, and important enough for the Japanese to want to take it. The Marines on Wake had been there for months, working alongside civilian contractors to build up the island's defenses. They had 6 5-inch coastal defense guns, 12 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, and a dozen Wildcat fighters from Marine Fighter Squadron 211. They had ammunition, some food supplies, and a determination to hold the island no matter what came at them. What they didn't have was any illusions about their situation. Wake Island was 2,300 miles from Pearl Harbor and 1,500 miles from the nearest American base. If the Japanese attacked, the Marines would be completely on their own. The attack came at noon. 36 Japanese bombers from the Marshall Islands appeared over Wake without warning. The island had no radar, no early warning system. The first indication the defenders had that war had come to Wake Island was the sound of engines overhead and then bombs falling. The Japanese bombers destroyed 7 of the 12 Wildcat fighters on the ground, killed or wounded dozens of Marines and civilian workers, and destroyed fuel supplies and ammunition dumps. Within minutes of the first attack, Wake Island's defensive capability had been cut nearly in half. But the Marines who survived that first raid were not thinking about surrender. They were thinking about revenge. Over the next 15 days, those 449 Marines would write one of the most inspiring chapters in United States Marine Corps history. They would sink 2 Japanese destroyers, damage 3 cruisers, shoot down dozens of aircraft, and repel the first Japanese amphibious assault of the Pacific War. They would force the Japanese to commit far more resources to taking the island than anyone thought possible. And they would create a legend with a message that was almost certainly never sent, but became one of the most famous quotes of World War II. This is the story of Wake Island, the tiny atoll where a handful of Marines held off the Japanese Empire for 15 days and became symbols of American determination and fighting spirit. Wake Island sits in the middle of nowhere. The nearest landmass of any significance is hundreds of miles away in any direction. The atoll consists of 3 small islands, Wake, Wilkes, and Peel, forming a rough U-shape around a lagoon. The total land area is just under 3 square miles. Before the war, Wake had been uninhabited except for occasional visits by Pan American Airways Clipper planes using it as a refueling stop. There were no native inhabitants, no resources, nothing of value except its location. In 1941, as tensions with Japan increased, the United States Navy realized that Wake Island's location made it strategically important. Aircraft flying from Hawaii to the Philippines needed refueling stops, and Wake was perfectly positioned for that role. The Navy contracted with Morrison Knudsen Company to build an airfield and expand the harbor facilities. By December 1941, over 1,000 civilian workers were on the island, working around the clock to complete the construction before war started. The Marine detachment assigned to defend Wake was commanded by Major James Devereux. a career officer who understood immediately that his situation was nearly impossible. He had fewer than 500 Marines to defend 3 separate islands. His defensive weapons were limited, and many were still being installed when war broke out. He had no naval support, no army backup, and no realistic prospect of reinforcement if the Japanese attacked in force. His orders were simple: defend Wake Island for as long as possible. Nobody told him how long that was supposed to be, and nobody really expected the island to hold out for more than a few days if the Japanese came in strength. Devereux set about preparing his defenses with grim determination. He positioned the coastal defense guns to cover the approaches to the lagoon and the likely landing beaches. He dug gun pits, laid barbed wire, positioned machine guns, and prepared defensive positions. The Marines worked alongside the civilian contractors, digging foxholes in the coral, filling sandbags, and preparing for a battle they all knew was coming. The work was brutal in the tropical heat, and the coral was so hard that digging was back-breaking labor. But the Marines kept working because they knew their lives would depend on those preparations. The island's air defense consisted of 12 Wildcat fighters under the command of Major Paul Putnam. These were good aircraft, better than anything the Japanese had in some respects, but 12 fighters weren't nearly enough to defend the island against sustained air attack. Putnam's pilots were young, most had never been in combat, and they were facing the prospect of fighting against overwhelming numbers with no hope of replacement aircraft when theirs were damaged or destroyed. They knew the odds, but like the ground Marines, they were determined to make the Japanese pay for Wake Island. The first Japanese raid on December 8th destroyed half of Wake's air power in minutes. 7 of the 12 Wildcats were caught on the ground and destroyed. The surviving 5 fighters became precious resources that had to be husbanded carefully. Major Putnam and his pilots salvaged parts from the wrecked aircraft and kept the remaining fighters operational through sheer determination and mechanical ingenuity. When hydraulic fluid ran out, they used bourbon whiskey as a substitute. When parts broke, they fabricated replacements from damaged aircraft. The pilots and mechanics worked 20-hour days keeping those 5 fighters flying. The Japanese bombers returned on December 9th, then again on December 10th. Each raid brought dozens of bombers that pounded the island's defenses, destroyed supplies, and killed Marines and civilians. The defenders had no way to prevent these attacks. The anti-aircraft guns shot down a few bombers, and the remaining Wildcats intercepted when they could, but the Japanese kept coming. Wake Island was being systematically pounded, and there was nothing the defenders could do except endure the bombing and wait for the next attack. The Marines and civilian workers lived in foxholes and trenches, emerging after each raid to repair damage, move supplies, and prepare for the next attack. Men worked while exhausted, went without sleep for days, and kept fighting because there was no alternative. The wounded were treated in a makeshift hospital with limited medical supplies. The dead were buried in hastily dug graves. And every man on the island understood that reinforcement wasn't coming, that they were alone, and that they would probably die on this worthless piece of coral in the middle of the Pacific. But morale remained surprisingly high. The Marines had been trained to fight, and now they were fighting. They were taking casualties, they were being bombed daily, and they were facing impossible odds. But they were United States Marines, and they would not surrender without making the Japanese bleed for every yard of coral. Major Devereux moved among his men, checking defenses, encouraging the troops, and maintaining the discipline and unit cohesion that would prove critical in the coming battle. He knew his Marines were scared. Everyone was scared, but fear could be controlled and channeled into effective fighting if leadership was strong and confidence remained high. Before dawn on December 11th, lookouts on Wake Island spotted ships on the horizon. The Japanese were coming, not with bombers, but with an invasion force. 3 light cruisers, 6 destroyers, and 2 patrol boats approached the island carrying approximately 450 Japanese Special Naval Landing Force troops. The Japanese commander expected minimal resistance. His intelligence told him that Wake's defenses had been destroyed by the bombing raids, that the garrison was demoralized and ready to surrender. He planned to land his troops, accept the American surrender, and move on to his next objective. Major Devereux had other plans. He ordered his Marines to hold their fire until the Japanese ships were well within range of the coastal defense guns. The 5-inch guns had been carefully positioned and camouflaged. The Japanese didn't know where they were, or even if they were still operational after the bombing. Devereux wanted the Japanese ships close enough that his gunners couldn't miss. As the Japanese ships approached the shore and prepared to launch landing craft, Devereux gave the order to fire. The coastal defense guns opened up at point-blank range. The first salvo hit the destroyer Hayate directly, penetrating the ship's magazine. The destroyer exploded in a massive fireball and sank within minutes, taking almost all of her crew with her. It was the first Japanese surface warship sunk by American forces in World War II, and the men of Wake Island had just scored that victory. The other coastal guns targeted the remaining Japanese ships. Shells slammed into the destroyer Kisaragi, hitting her depth charges and causing a catastrophic explosion that sent the destroyer to the bottom. 2 destroyers sunk in the first minutes of the engagement. The remaining Japanese ships turned and fled, laying smoke screens and retreating at maximum speed. The invasion force that was supposed to easily overwhelm Wake's defenses was running away, but the Marines weren't finished. Major Putnam ordered the 4 remaining operational Wildcats into the air. The fighters caught the retreating Japanese ships and attacked with bombs and machine gun fire. They scored hits on the cruiser Tenryu and other vessels, causing casualties and damage. The Japanese force fled north, leaving behind 2 sunken destroyers and over 500 dead sailors. The Battle of Wake Island's first round had gone to the Marines. They had sunk 2 enemy warships, damaged several others, and sent the invasion force retreating. The Marines had proven that Wake Island would not be an easy conquest. News of the victory electrified the American public, desperate for good news after the disaster at Pearl Harbor. Wake Island became a symbol of American resistance and determination. The Marines, who had been expecting to die fighting on a forgotten atoll, had become national heroes. It was after this first Japanese defeat that the legendary message, "Send us more Japs," supposedly originated. The story goes that the Navy command in Hawaii sent a message to Wake asking about the garrison's status and needs. Commander Winfield Scott Cunningham, the overall commander on Wake, sent a reply listing supplies needed and ending with a padding phrase. Padding phrases were extra words added to messages to make them harder for enemy code breakers to decipher. According to legend, a radio operator in Hawaii removed the padding but left in the phrase, "Send us more Japs," thinking it was part of the actual message. The phrase was passed up the chain of command and eventually released to the press, where it became one of the most famous quotes of the war. The American public, reeling from Pearl Harbor and hungry for evidence that Americans were fighting back, embraced the defiant message. It appeared in newspapers across the country, was used in recruiting posters, and became a rallying cry. The truth is more complicated. Commander Cunningham later stated that he never sent any such message, that it was a creation of over-eager public relations officers looking for good propaganda material. The phrase, "Send us more Japs," probably never actually came from Wake Island. But the legend persisted because it captured something true about the spirit of the Wake Island defenders. Whether the message was real or not, the attitude it expressed was genuine. The Marines on Wake were willing to keep fighting, and if the Japanese wanted to take the island, they would have to send more troops because the first group hadn't been enough. The legend of the message was useful for American morale, so military authorities didn't debunk it. The Marines on Wake, when they learned about it later, generally found it amusing rather than offensive. They knew they hadn't said it, but they appreciated the sentiment. They were defiant, they were determined, and if there had been a way to get more Japanese to come attack them just so they could kill more of the enemy, some of them probably would have requested it. After the failed first invasion attempt, the Japanese were furious and embarrassed. They had been humiliated by a tiny garrison of Marines on an insignificant atoll. This could not be allowed to stand. The Japanese High Command ordered Vice Admiral Sadamichi Kajioka to take Wake Island, and this time to do it properly. Kajioka assembled a much larger force, including aircraft carriers Soryu and Hiryu, which had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack. These carriers brought over 100 additional aircraft to pound Wake into submission. The bombing intensified dramatically. Instead of daily raids by 36 bombers, Wake was now being hit by waves of aircraft from the carriers in addition to land-based bombers from the Marshall Islands. The defenders were under almost constant air attack. The remaining Wildcats fought desperately, shooting down Japanese aircraft in dogfights over the island, but the numerical superiority was overwhelming. One by one, the American fighters were shot down or destroyed on the ground. By December 22nd, there were no operational American aircraft left on Wake Island. The Marines endured the bombing in their foxholes and trenches, emerging after each raid to repair what could be repaired and prepare for the next attack. Casualties mounted steadily. Supplies dwindled. Ammunition for the anti-aircraft guns was running low. Food was rationed. Water was scarce. Medical supplies were almost exhausted. The men were surviving on minimal sleep, working around the clock, and fighting off exhaustion, fear, and the growing realization that relief was not coming. In Hawaii, there were plans to relieve Wake Island. Task Force 14, centered around the aircraft carrier Saratoga, was dispatched with Marine reinforcements, supplies, and ammunition. But the task force moved slowly, delayed by refueling problems and excessive caution from its commander. As Task Force 14 approached Wake, news came that Pearl Harbor had been attacked again by Japanese submarines. The task force was ordered to return to Hawaii. Wake Island would not be relieved. The 449 Marines and the civilian workers who had stayed to fight were on their own. The defenders didn't know that relief had been turned back. They kept fighting because that's what Marines do. They maintained their positions, conserved their ammunition, and prepared for the invasion they knew would come. Major WWII rotated his men through the defensive positions, giving everyone some rest when possible. He maintained discipline and unit cohesion even as the situation became increasingly desperate. The Marines trusted him, and he refused to betray that trust by giving up or showing despair. Just after 2 in the morning on December 23rd, the Japanese invasion force approached Wake Island for the second time. This force was far larger than the first attempt. 2,000 Japanese Special Naval Landing Force troops on multiple transports, supported by cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, moved toward the island under cover of darkness. The Japanese had learned from their first defeat. This time, they would land overwhelming force on multiple beaches simultaneously, preventing the Marines from concentrating their defense. The landing began at 2:30 in the morning. Japanese troops came ashore on the southern beaches of Wake Island, on Wilkes Island to the south, and on Peel Island to the north. The Marines fought desperately, but they were spread too thin to defend all 3 islands simultaneously. The coastal defense guns that had sunk 2 destroyers 11 days earlier fired at the Japanese ships and landing craft, scoring hits and causing casualties, but there were too many targets and not enough guns. On Wilkes Island, fewer than 70 Marines held off over 700 Japanese attackers for several hours of intense close combat. Fighting with rifles, machine guns, and grenades, the Marines contested every yard of the island. Japanese casualties were severe, with attackers piling up in front of Marine positions, but the sheer weight of numbers eventually told. The Marines on Wilkes were being overwhelmed, not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked ammunition and reinforcements. On Wake Island proper, Japanese troops pushed inland against fierce resistance. The Marines fought from prepared positions, falling back when they had to, counterattacking when they could. The civilian workers who had armed themselves fought alongside the Marines, using rifles and pistols to defend the island they had helped build. The battle raged through the early morning hours, with neither side giving quarter. By dawn, Major WWII had to face reality. The Japanese had landed in overwhelming force. Ammunition was almost exhausted. Casualties were mounting. The Marines still fighting were isolated in small groups, unable to coordinate their defense. Further resistance would result in the annihilation of the entire garrison, with no military benefit. The battle for Wake Island was lost. Commander Cunningham, the overall island commander, made the decision to surrender. At 7:30 in the morning on December 23rd, 1941, he ordered white flags to be raised. The Battle of Wake Island was over. The Marines who had held out for 15 days against overwhelming odds, who had sunk 2 destroyers and damaged multiple other ships, who had shot down dozens of aircraft and killed hundreds of enemy troops, laid down their weapons, and became prisoners of war. The Japanese had taken Wake Island, but the cost had been far higher than anyone expected. Japanese casualties were over 820 killed and over 1,000 wounded, many seriously. 2 destroyers had been sunk, several other ships damaged, and dozens of aircraft destroyed. The Japanese had committed 2 aircraft carriers and substantial naval forces to taking a tiny atoll that should have fallen in a single day. The battle for Wake had tied up Japanese resources and delayed their operations elsewhere in the Pacific. American casualties were lighter in absolute numbers, but represented a larger percentage of the defending force. 49 Marines had been killed in the fighting, with dozens more wounded. The civilian workers who had fought suffered similar casualties. The survivors, approximately 470 military personnel and over 1,000 civilians, became prisoners of war. They faced years of brutal captivity in Japanese prison camps. Many would not survive to see liberation. But Wake Island had achieved something important beyond the tactical level. The 15-day defense demonstrated that Americans could fight and defeat Japanese forces. At a time when the United States had suffered nothing but defeats and disasters, Wake Island showed that determined Americans with adequate weapons could hold their own against the Japanese military. The publicity surrounding the battle boosted American morale at a critical time. The defiant legend of "Send us more Japs" became a symbol of American fighting spirit. The Marines who fought at Wake became heroes. Their defense of the island was studied at military academies. Books were written about the battle. Movies depicted their stand. The Wake Island defenders received numerous decorations, including the first Presidential Unit Citation awarded to a Marine unit. Major Devereux received the Navy Cross for his leadership during the battle. The legend of Wake Island became part of Marine Corps lore, an example of courage and determination under impossible circumstances. The story of Wake Island didn't end with the surrender. The prisoners faced years of brutal captivity that tested their endurance as severely as the battle had tested their courage. The Japanese separated the military prisoners from the civilian workers. The military personnel were shipped to prison camps in China and Japan, where they endured starvation rations, disease, forced labor, and abuse. Many died in captivity. Those who survived emerged from the camps in August 1945, weighing barely 100 pounds, suffering from malnutrition and disease. The civilian prisoners had an even worse fate. 98 civilians who remained on Wake Island were forced to work as slave labor, building fortifications for the Japanese. In October 1943, fearing an American invasion, the Japanese commander on Wake ordered these civilians executed. They were blindfolded, taken to the northern end of the island, and machine-gunned. One man survived the massacre and escaped, only to be recaptured and beheaded. This war crime was prosecuted after the war, and the Japanese commander responsible was convicted and executed for ordering the murders. The Marines and sailors who survived captivity carried psychological and physical scars for the rest of their lives. Many suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The experience of defending Wake Island, followed by years in brutal prison camps, left permanent marks. Some adapted and moved forward with their lives. Others struggled with nightmares, survivors' guilt, and difficulty readjusting to civilian life. Major Devereux survived the war and wrote a memoir about the Wake Island defense. He spent the rest of his life speaking about the battle and honoring the men who had fought under his command. He consistently downplayed his own role while praising the courage and determination of the Marines and civilian workers who had defended the island. He maintained contact with as many survivors as he could, attending reunions and memorial services until his death in 1979. Historians have debated whether the defense of Wake Island was militarily significant or merely symbolically important. The island itself had limited strategic value. The Japanese captured it and used it as a base, but it never played a critical role in their operations. The Americans bypassed it later in the war, leaving the Japanese garrison isolated and ineffective. In purely military terms, Wake Island was not a crucial objective for either side. But the 15-day defense had effects beyond the immediate tactical situation. The Japanese were forced to commit substantial forces to taking the island, forces that could have been used elsewhere. The carriers Soryu and Hiryu spent over a week supporting operations against Wake, time they weren't available for other missions. The two destroyers sunk at Wake were warships the Japanese couldn't replace. Every aircraft shot down was one less aircraft available for operations elsewhere. More importantly, Wake Island demonstrated to both sides that American forces could fight effectively. The Japanese had assumed that American forces would collapse quickly when faced with determined attack. Wake Island proved that assumption wrong. Japanese planners began to realize that conquering American positions would be more costly and time-consuming than they had anticipated. This affected Japanese strategic planning for the rest of the war. For the Americans, Wake Island was a morale victory, at a time when victories of any kind were desperately needed. After Pearl Harbor, the Philippines were falling, Guam had been captured, and American forces were in retreat everywhere. Wake Island was the one place where Americans had stood and fought successfully, even if they eventually lost. The battle showed that Americans could kill Japanese soldiers, sink Japanese ships, and shoot down Japanese aircraft. This was critically important for American morale in the dark early days of the war. Today, over 80 years after the battle, Wake Island remains a symbol of Marine Corps courage and determination. The battle is taught to every Marine recruit as an example of how a small force with good leadership can achieve results far beyond what numbers would suggest possible. The defense of Wake demonstrates the importance of preparation, leadership, unit cohesion, and fighting spirit. The island itself is still a U.S. territory, though it's now administered by the Air Force as a remote airfield and missile testing site. The remains of the 1941 defenses are still visible. Concrete gun emplacements slowly eroding in the Pacific weather, rusting barbed wire disappearing into the coral. The island is rarely visited by anyone except military personnel and occasional researchers. But for those who do visit, the sense of history is powerful. The 98 civilians executed by the Japanese in 1943 are commemorated by a memorial on the island. Their names are carved in stone as a reminder of the price paid by those who defended Wake. The Japanese commander who ordered their execution was tried and hanged for war crimes after the war, one of the few Japanese officers executed specifically for crimes against American prisoners. The Marines who fought at Wake are remembered in Corps history as examples of everything Marines should be. Their courage, determination, and refusal to surrender without a fight embodied the Marine ethos. The fact that they eventually lost the battle doesn't diminish their accomplishment. They fought against impossible odds, held out longer than anyone expected, and made the Japanese pay a heavy price for their victory. It's worth returning to the legendary "Send us more Japs" message one final time. The message almost certainly was never sent from Wake Island. It was probably created by a public relations officer in Hawaii or Washington who understood the value of defiant rhetoric for morale purposes. The defenders of Wake Island never knew about the message until after the war, when survivors learned that they had supposedly sent it. But here's the interesting thing. When the survivors learned about the message, most of them liked it. Even though they knew it was fabricated, even though it misrepresented what had actually been communicated from Wake, they felt it captured their spirit accurately. They had been defiant. They had been determined to make the Japanese pay for every yard of coral. They had fought with courage and skill. The message, though false, was true to the spirit of their defense. Some of the survivors objected to the message because it seemed to trivialize what they had endured. The reality of Wake Island was cold, fear, exhaustion, watching friends die, and eventually surrendering because there was no other choice. The cheerful defiance of "send us more Japs" seemed to gloss over the suffering and sacrifice. But most survivors understood that the message served a purpose. It gave hope to Americans at home. It showed the Japanese that Americans would fight. It became a rallying cry that helped sustain morale through the dark early days of the war. The legend of the message, true or not, became inseparable from the legend of Wake Island. And that legend, based on real events even if embellished in the telling, served to honor the men who fought there and inspire the Marines who came after them. On December 8, 1941, 449 United States Marines stood on Wake Island, facing the Japanese Empire with inadequate weapons, no hope of reinforcement, and orders to defend an indefensible position. For 15 days, they held that position. They sank 2 destroyers, damaged multiple ships, shot down dozens of aircraft, and repelled the first Japanese invasion attempt. They fought with courage, skill, and determination against overwhelming odds. When they finally surrendered on December 23rd, they had given the American people a symbol of resistance and hope. They had demonstrated that Japanese forces could be fought and defeated. They had proven that United States Marines would stand and fight even when the situation seemed hopeless. The cost was terrible. Men died defending that coral atoll. Survivors endured years of brutal captivity. Some never made it home, but the legend they created lives on. Wake Island remains one of the most celebrated battles in Marine Corps history. The defenders became symbols of American courage and determination. Whether they said, "Send us more Japs" or not, whether the message was real or fabricated, the spirit it embodied was genuine. Those Marines would have kept fighting if they could. They would have welcomed the chance to kill more of the enemy. They were United States Marines, and surrender came only when continued resistance became physically impossible. This is the story of Wake Island, where 449 Marines held off an empire for 15 days and created a legend that still inspires over 80 years later. They didn't win their battle, but they won something more important. They won respect, they won honor, and they won their place in history as some of the finest warriors America ever produced. The battle for Wake Island was lost, but the Marines who fought there were never defeated.